March 2026. Oil prices jumped from $70 a barrel to over $80 in less than a week. Tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz ground to a near standstill. Aviation across the Gulf region shut down. Stock markets dropped. And the global economy, which had been operating on the assumption that 21% of the world's oil would continue flowing through a 21-mile-wide passage of water between Iran and Oman, suddenly had to confront the possibility that it might not. This was not the first time the Strait of Hormuz had been threatened. It was not even the first time it had been partially closed. But it was the most dramatic demonstration in decades of a fact that the global economy prefers not to think about too carefully. That the single most important piece of energy infrastructure on Earth is a narrow channel of water that sits directly between one of the most volatile regions in the world and the rest of the planet's fuel supply. Welcome to the Industrial Ledger. This is where we examine the systems that actually run the world, the infrastructure that makes modern life possible, and what happens when that infrastructure breaks. If that is the kind of conversation you are here for, subscribe. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. It sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the body of water that separates the Arabian Peninsula from Iran. On one side is Iran. On the other side is Oman. And between them flows approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day. That is roughly 1/5 of all the oil consumed globally. 1/3 of all seaborne traded oil. More than passes through the Suez Canal. More than is produced by any country except the United States and Saudi Arabia. The reason all of this oil moves through the strait is geography. The Persian Gulf is a dead end. It is surrounded by land on 3 sides. Iran to the north and east. Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates along the western and southern coasts. And at the southern tip, where the Gulf opens to the ocean, there is the strait. 21 miles wide. The only way out. If you are shipping oil from the massive fields in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, or Iran itself, your tanker is going through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no alternative route that does not involve adding thousands of miles to the journey and costs that make the economics unworkable. Pipelines exist that bypass the strait, the most important being Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline that runs from the Gulf Coast to the Red Sea, and the UAE's pipeline to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. But the combined capacity of these pipelines is around 5 million barrels per day. Useful. Significant. But nowhere near enough to replace the 21 million barrels that move through the strait by tanker. The strait itself is not a uniform 21-mile-wide channel. The navigable shipping lanes are much narrower. Under international maritime law, ships transiting the strait are required to follow a traffic separation scheme. Inbound traffic, ships entering the Gulf, use one lane. Outbound traffic, ships leaving the Gulf, use another lane. Each lane is about 2 miles wide. Between them is a 2-mile-wide separation zone. The rest of the strait is either too shallow for large tankers or falls within territorial waters that are not part of the transit corridor. So the actual pathway through which 21 million barrels of oil per day moves is not 21 miles wide. It is 2 miles wide. For outbound traffic. 2 miles. Through waters that are within range of Iranian coastal missile batteries, Iranian naval forces, and Iranian drones. The vulnerability is not theoretical. It is geometric. A fully loaded supertanker, the kind that moves crude oil from Gulf terminals to refineries in Asia, Europe, and beyond, is not a fast or maneuverable vessel. It is over 300 meters long. It displaces hundreds of thousands of tons. It requires miles of open water to change course or come to a stop. When it is transiting the strait, moving through a 2-mile-wide lane at 12 to 15 knots, it is not evading anything. It is a slow-moving target in a narrow corridor. And there are dozens of them. At any given moment, there are tankers moving through the strait in both directions. Inbound tankers arriving empty to load crude at terminals in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, or the UAE. Outbound tankers departing fully loaded, heading to refineries in Asia, primarily China, Japan, South Korea, and India, which together account for the majority of Gulf oil exports. The flow is constant. The schedule is tight. The entire system depends on the assumption that the strait remains open and safe to transit. When that assumption breaks, the consequences are immediate. March 2026 was not the first time. The Strait of Hormuz has been a military and economic flashpoint for decades. The most serious prolonged conflict was the tanker war of the 1980s, fought during the Iran-Iraq War. Between 1984 and 1988, both Iran and Iraq targeted tankers moving through the Gulf in an attempt to disrupt each other's oil exports and put economic pressure on the other side. Iraq, which had limited access to the Gulf because most of its coastline had been contested or blocked, used airstrikes to attack tankers loading at Iranian terminals or transiting near Iranian waters. Iran retaliated by attacking tankers associated with Iraq's allies, primarily Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and by laying mines in the shipping lanes. Over 500 attacks on commercial shipping occurred during the tanker war. Tankers were hit by missiles, bombs, naval gunfire, and mines. Crew members were killed. Ships were damaged or sunk. Insurance rates for vessels transiting the Gulf skyrocketed. Some shipping companies refused to send tankers into the region at all. And yet the oil kept moving. Not at the same volume. Not without disruption. But it kept moving because the global economy had no choice but to keep it moving. The United States intervened directly. In 1987, the U.S. agreed to reflag Kuwaiti tankers, allowing them to fly the American flag and receive protection from the U.S. Navy. Operation Earnest Will, as it was called, involved U.S. warships escorting convoys of tankers through the Gulf and the Strait. The U.S. Navy also conducted minesweeping operations to clear the shipping lanes. The presence of American military power reduced the frequency of attacks, but did not eliminate them entirely. Iranian forces continued to harass shipping. U.S. forces responded with strikes on Iranian oil platforms and naval vessels. The tanker war ended in 1988, not because the strait had been secured, but because the broader Iran-Iraq war ended. The infrastructure damage was significant. Iranian oil export capacity had been reduced. Kuwaiti and Saudi terminals had been damaged. Insurance costs remained elevated for years. But the strait itself had remained open. The oil had continued to flow. And the lesson learned by every party involved was clear. The Strait of Hormuz could be threatened, could be attacked, could be made dangerous and expensive to transit. But closing it entirely was extraordinarily difficult, and the consequences of even trying were severe. 30 years later, in 2019, the strait was back in the headlines. A series of attacks on tankers near the strait, including Norwegian and Japanese vessels, resulted in explosions and fires that damaged the ships, but did not sink them. The United States blamed Iran. Iran denied responsibility. The attacks were sophisticated, targeted, and designed to send a message without triggering a full-scale military response. Oil prices spiked. Tanker insurance rates increased. Naval forces from the US, UK, and other countries increased patrols in the region. And once again, the strait remained open. The attacks demonstrated vulnerability, but not closure. The reason the strait has never been fully closed, despite decades of conflict and repeated threats, is not that it cannot be done. It is that doing so is an act of economic warfare with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate parties to any conflict. Closing the strait does not just hurt the countries exporting oil through it. It hurts the entire global economy. Oil prices spike. Supply chains that depend on petrochemicals, plastics, synthetic materials, all of which are derived from crude oil, face shortages. Inflation accelerates. Industries that have nothing to do with energy directly, manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, all face increased costs. And the countries that export oil through the Strait, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, are among the wealthiest in the region precisely because they can export oil. Closing the strait damages their economies as much or more than it damages their adversaries. Iran, which also exports oil through the strait when sanctions allow, faces the same problem. Threatening to close the strait is leverage. Actually closing it is economic self-destruction. But leverage is valuable, and Iran has used it repeatedly. The ability to threaten the strait, to make tanker transit dangerous, to force navies to deploy, to spike insurance costs and oil prices with limited actual military action, is a strategic asset that Iran has deployed whenever it has faced pressure from the United States, Israel, or regional rivals. The strait is not just a shipping lane. It is a weapon, one that has been drawn repeatedly but never fully used. March 2026 was different in scale, but not in kind. The strikes on Iran by the United States and Israel triggered Iranian retaliation that included attacks on U.S. military bases across the region and on Israeli targets. The strait became a war zone. Tanker traffic stopped not because Iran formally blockaded it, but because shipping companies refused to send vessels into an active conflict area. Insurance became prohibitively expensive or unavailable entirely. The flow of oil through the strait, which had continued even during the tanker war, dropped to a fraction of normal levels within days. And oil prices responded exactly as expected. Brent crude, which had been trading around $70 per barrel before the conflict, jumped to over $80 within a week. Analysts predicted further increases if the closure persisted. $100 per barrel. Higher if the conflict escalated or if infrastructure at Gulf terminals was damaged. The market was pricing in not just the immediate supply disruption, but the possibility that the situation could deteriorate further. The immediate response from governments with strategic petroleum reserves was predictable. The United States, China, Japan, South Korea, and several European nations announced coordinated releases from their reserves to stabilize markets and prevent panic buying. Strategic reserves exist precisely for this kind of disruption. They are stockpiles of crude oil held by governments to cushion against supply shocks. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve alone holds hundreds of millions of barrels. China has built massive reserve capacity over the past 2 decades. Japan and South Korea, both heavily dependent on Gulf oil imports, maintain reserves sufficient to cover months of consumption. Releasing reserves puts oil into the market quickly. It signals to traders that supply will not collapse entirely even if the strait remains closed. It prevents the kind of speculative price spiral that can turn a physical supply disruption into a financial crisis. And it buys time. Time for diplomacy. Time for military de-escalation. Time for shipping companies to assess risk and decide whether to resume transits. Time for alternative supply routes to scale up if the closure persists. But reserves are finite. They can stabilize markets for weeks or months. They cannot replace the strait indefinitely. If the closure had persisted into April, May, June, reserves would have started to run low. Governments would have faced decisions about rationing, about prioritizing critical industries, about how to allocate limited supplies across competing demands. The global economy would have entered a fundamentally different state. Not a temporary disruption. A structural supply crisis. That did not happen. By mid-March, tanker traffic through the strait began to resume. Not at full volume. Not without heightened security. Naval escorts. Increased insurance costs. Slower transit speeds. But the flow restarted. The immediate crisis passed. Oil prices stabilized and began to retreat from their peaks. The reserve releases were scaled back. The global economy exhaled. But the episode demonstrated something that policymakers and energy analysts have known for decades, but prefer not to dwell on. The entire global energy system is built on the assumption that a 21-mile wide passage of water between 2 hostile countries will remain open. That assumption has held for decades. It held during the Iran-Iraq War. It held during the 2019 tanker attacks. It held barely in March 2026. But it is an assumption, not a guarantee. And the consequences of it failing are catastrophic. There are no good alternatives. The pipelines that bypass the strait, Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline and the UAE's pipeline to Fujairah, can handle a fraction of the volume. Expanding their capacity would take years and billions of dollars in investment. Shipping oil around the southern tip of Africa, avoiding the strait and the Suez Canal entirely, adds weeks to transit time and makes the economics unworkable for most buyers. Increasing production in other regions, the United States, Canada, Brazil, to offset lost Gulf supply, is possible in theory, but takes time to scale and cannot fully replace the specific grades of crude that Gulf producers export. The strait is irreplaceable, not because alternatives do not exist, but because the cost and time required to implement those alternatives at the scale needed to replace 21 million barrels per day of oil transit is so high that no rational economic actor has ever invested in building them. The global economy has instead chosen to accept the risk. To build refineries, supply chains, transportation networks, and entire industries on the assumption that the strait will remain open. And to deploy military force when necessary to ensure that it does. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, exists primarily for this purpose. Its mission is to ensure freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the surrounding waters. It conducts patrols. It monitors Iranian naval activity. It escorts tankers when necessary. It coordinates with regional allies to maintain a military presence sufficient to deter Iran from closing the strait. And when deterrence fails, as it nearly did in March 2026, the Fifth Fleet is the force that would be tasked with reopening it. The military capability required to keep the strait open is not trivial. Minesweepers to clear any mines Iran might deploy. Anti-ship missile defenses to protect tankers and naval vessels from Iranian coastal batteries. Air superiority to prevent Iranian aircraft or drones from attacking shipping. Naval forces capable of engaging Iranian fast attack craft and submarines. The logistics, the coordination, the sustained presence, all of it requires significant resources and continuous commitment. And Iran knows this. The threat to close the strait is not an idle one. Iran has the capability to make transit dangerous, to lay mines, to launch missile and drone attacks, to use fast attack craft to harass tankers. Fully closing the strait, maintaining a blockade against sustained American and allied military opposition, is far more difficult. But making the strait dangerous enough that commercial shipping refuses to transit, that insurance becomes prohibitively expensive, that the flow of oil slows to a trickle, that is achievable. And that is enough. This is why the Strait of Hormuz matters. Not because it is the only choke point in the global energy system. The Suez Canal, the Malacca Strait, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Panama Canal, all of them are critical passages that global trade depends on. But the Strait of Hormuz is the most important. It carries more oil. It sits in a more volatile region. It is more vulnerable to disruption. And the consequences of its closure are more immediate and more severe than any other choke point on Earth. March 2026 was a reminder. Not a lesson learned for the first time, but a reminder of something the global economy has known for decades and chosen to live with. That the energy infrastructure that powers industrial civilization, that fuels transportation networks, that feeds petrochemical industries, that underpins manufacturing supply chains, is fragile. That it depends on geography, on narrow passages of water, on political stability in regions that are not stable. That it can be disrupted quickly, and the disruption cascades through the global economy within days. The strait is open now. Tankers are transiting. Oil is flowing. Prices have stabilized. The crisis has passed. Until the next one. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not a problem that has been solved. It is a risk that has been managed. And managing it requires continuous vigilance, military presence, diplomatic engagement, and the willingness to accept that the system could break at any moment. The industrial ledger exists to examine the infrastructure that runs the modern world and what happens when that infrastructure is tested. If you want more of this kind of analysis, if you want to understand the systems that most people take for granted until they break, subscribe.